My final thoughts on adolescence and my professional practice. Sorry my voice isn't where I'd like it to be. I had pneumonia over Thanksgiving break. My final thoughts are that the adolescent brain does exist, and it is a period of neurological development when certain things are happening. Instead of rehashing Jensen and Epstein right now, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Jane Blakemore, FBA. FBA stands for Fellowship of the British Academy. It's an award granted by the British Academy to leading academics for their distinction in the humanities and social sciences. She's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London and co-director of the Wellcome Trust PhD program in neuroscience at UCL as well. Boyce quotes Blakemore, who says, "Whenever I tell people I work on the adolescent brain, the first thing they say is, 'Whoa, does it actually exist?' Or something like that. Almost always, it's meant as a joke, but it's quite puzzling why it is so acceptable to make these kinds of jokes about an entire group of people." So, Epstein and Blakemore walk into a bar. Walters quotes Blakemore's 2012 TED Talk, in which she says 15 years ago, now about 22 years ago, it was widely assumed that the vast majority of brain development takes place in the first few years of life. Back then, we didn't have the ability to look inside the living human brain and track development across the lifespan. But that has changed. It's not all over in early childhood, but continues right throughout adolescence and into the 20s and 30s. In her 2012 TED Talk, Blakemore claims adolescence is defined as the period of life that starts with the biological, hormonal, and physical changes of puberty and ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. It can go on a long time. This made me think of the Step Brothers movie. Or, more unfortunately, myself. Another 30-year-old adolescent. This is me, my daughter, a goat, and our puppy, who's now a mother of her own puppies. Blakemore explains both MRI and fMRI studies point to adolescence as a period of continued neural development. She says the ability to see inside the developing human brain and track developmental changes, both in terms of structure and function, is relatively recent. The past 15 years, now about 22 years, has seen an explosion in the number of studies using neuroimaging techniques to investigate maturational changes in the human brain. These studies point to adolescence as a period of continued neural development. The next 20 years of development neuroimaging might focus on more complex questions, including the development of functional connectivity, how gender and puberty influence adolescent brain development, the effects of genes, environment and culture on the adolescent brain, development of the atypical adolescent brain, and implications for policy of study of the adolescent brain. This is an exciting time for developmental cognitive neuroscience, a young field that is set to continue to expand and mature over the next 2 decades. Blakemore says adolescence is characterized by making risky decisions, particularly modulated by emotion and social factors. For example, when adolescents are with peers or in other affective hot contexts. The Harvard Health blog says resisting social pressure is also more difficult for teenagers. Much of their troubling behavior, from gang violence to reckless driving and drinking, occurs in groups and because of group pressure. In a psychological experiment, adolescents and adults took a driving simulation test that allowed them to win a reward by running a yellow light and stopping before they hit a wall. Adolescents, but not adults, were more likely to take extra chances when friends were watching. We're going to watch a short video about a similar study.
Call it a creative use of paved space.
It's like an art form, really. It's like art with your feet.
Teens honing their skateboarding skills. Andrew McWilliams goes big if there's an audience.
If you're by yourself, you don't really want to try something that crazy. But if you got friends hyping you up, then it's a lot easier to do.
So the first thing to know is teens make more risky choices when their friends are watching them.
It's no surprise to cognitive neuroscientist Jason Chine. Researchers at Temple University's Brain Research and Imaging Center monitor teens while performing a computerized stoplight task. Teens have to drive a car on a straight stretch of roadway and decide whether or not to stop at a yellow light. The goal? To finish the course as fast as possible while trying not to crash. Researchers used the intercom to tell teens they had friends nearby watching and making predictions about their performance. During the task, researchers saw activation in 2 regions of the teens' brains that process rewards.
In and of itself, it says to parents, be aware that even a good teen, even a smart teen, even a teen that has good information about their behavior is likely to behave differently when they're in the presence of their friends or when they think they're in a social environment.
Scientists also had teens aged 13 to 17 complete memory training every day for 1 month. They found those teens took fewer risks when watched by their peers. Researchers say memory training may help with self-regulation.
They're still waiting for their cognitive control systems to come online, but we might be able to give that system a boost.
A boost with special brain exercises that help develop emotional regulation and function.
The Harvard Health blog describes the onset of adolescence as beginning at puberty. The brain is reshaped. Neurons, gray matter, and synapses, junctions between neurons, proliferate in the cerebral cortex and then gradually pruned through adolescence. Eventually, more than 40% of all synapses are eliminated, largely in the frontal lobes. Walters paraphrases Blakemore and says we should think of it like pruning a rose bush. She advises, just as you might prune away weak branches to ensure the remaining branches stay strong, the brain is fine-tuning itself. The Harvard Health blog, meanwhile, I'm going to step back, and instead of reading all this and reiterating information we've already discussed in class, I provided copies to each of you of this blog post if you wish to read it. I found it very informative and concise. Walters points out Blakemore's argument that the demonization of adolescents is unfair. Their brains really are different. Blakemore recounts in her TED Talk the story of a friend who said that the thing he noticed most about his teenage daughters was their level of embarrassment around him. He said, before puberty, he'd say, stop messing around, and I'll sing you your favorite song. The girls would stop what they were doing and start behaving immediately. After puberty, that became a threat. The very notion of their dad singing in public was enough to make them behave. She says the audience laughs knowingly. I wonder, can embarrassing photos with your dad be such an example also? Walter stresses that Blakemore is particularly interested in the social brain, and she and her team are working to understand the network of brain regions we use to interact with other people. Take this photo for an example. This is a photograph of footballer or soccer player Michael Owen, who has just failed to score a goal. In front, a crowd of crushed fans, every single one of them with hands on heads, faces contorted, in identical pain. The picture shows us how instinctive and automatic social responses are. Within a split second, everyone is doing the same thing with their arms and faces. except the three guys in the back in the wrong section. It's not just a funny picture, it also illustrates how good we are at reading other people. Yet analyzing both adolescents and adults showed up some interesting patterns. The brain area called the medial prefrontal cortex is more active in adolescents when they make decisions than it is in adults, which suggests that adolescents really do use a different mental approach to make social decisions. She describes a test of social a test that shows that the ability to account for someone else's perspective is still developing even in relatively late stages of adolescence. If you have an adolescent son or daughter and think they find it difficult to take direction, you're right, they do. I'm going to take a break from talking right now to let Dr. Blakemore explain this test to you. I think she'll be able to do it a lot more eloquently than I right now.
Task, and I'll just give you another example of the kind of task that we use in my lab. So imagine that you're the participant in one of our experiments. You come to the lab, you see this computerized task. In this task, you see a set of shelves. Now, there are objects on these shelves, on some of them, and you'll notice there's a guy standing behind the set of shelves, and there are some objects that he can't see. They're occluded from his point of view with a kind of grey piece of wood. This is the same set of shelves from his point of view. Notice that there are only some objects that he can see, whereas there are many more objects that you can see. Now, your task is to move objects around. The director, standing behind the set of shelves, is going to direct you to move objects around. But remember, he's not going to ask you to move objects that he can't see. This introduces a really interesting condition whereby there's a kind of conflict between your perspective and the director's perspective. So imagine he tells you to move the top truck left. There are 3 trucks there. You're going to instinctively go for the white truck because that's the top truck from your perspective. But then you have to remember, oh, he can't see that truck, so he must mean me to move the blue truck, which is the top truck from his perspective. Now, believe it or not, normal, healthy, intelligent adults like you make errors about 50% of the time on that kind of trial. They move the white truck instead of the blue truck. So we give this kind of task to adolescents and adults, and we also have a control condition where there's no director, and instead we give people a rule. We tell them, okay, we're going to do exactly the same thing, but this time there's no director. Instead, you've got to ignore objects with a dark grey background. You'll see that this is exactly the same condition, only in the no director condition they just have to remember to apply this somewhat arbitrary rule, whereas in the director condition they have to remember to take into account the director's perspective in order to guide their ongoing behaviour. Okay, so if I just show you the percentage errors in a large developmental study we did, this is in a study ranging from age 7 to adulthood, and what you're going to see is the percentage errors in the adult group in both conditions. So the grey is the director condition, and you see that our intelligent adults are making errors about 50% of the time, whereas they make far fewer errors when there's no director present, when they just have to remember that rule of ignoring the grey background. Developmentally, these two conditions develop in exactly the same way between late childhood and mid-adolescence. There's an improvement, in other words, a reduction of errors in both of these trials, in both of these conditions. But it's when you compare the last two groups, the mid-adolescent group and the adult group, where things get really interesting, because there is no continued improvement in the no director condition. In other words, everything you need to do in order to remember the rule and apply it seems to be fully developed by mid-adolescence. Whereas in contrast, if you look at the last two grey bars, there's still a significant improvement in the director condition between mid-adolescence and adulthood. And what this means is that the ability to take into account someone else's perspective in order to guide ongoing behaviour, which is something, by the way, that we do in everyday life all the time, is still developing in mid to late adolescence. So if you have a teenage son or a daughter and you sometimes think they have problems taking other people's perspectives, you're right, they do, and this is why.
So, to reiterate, there's no improvement under the control group where there's no director and the teenagers and the adults just have to listen to the rule. So that got me thinking about how adolescents are capable. and can be competent. Summon Robert Epstein. So, jokes aside, I do agree with Epstein. I'm not really sure on his competency tests argument where teenagers should legally be allowed to do certain things if they can prove that they can pass competency tests on them. I'm just not buying that yet. But going back to Epstein's adultness tests, and while I'd like to see more data on more teens and more adults, I do agree with Epstein because the scores between teens and adults really were not all that different. Like Epstein says, 30% of teens between the ages of 13 and 17 scored above the median score for adults. Or another way of putting it is half of US adults scored lower than nearly a third of our teens on this basic test of adult competence. So I do agree with Epstein on this matter. Going back to Blakemore, Walters quotes her in that 40% of teenagers worldwide don't have access to secondary school education. Think about that for a minute. Or maybe a few seconds. This is the period of life when the brain is particularly adaptive and malleable. It's a fantastic opportunity for learning and creativity. I'm going to conclude this section of my presentation with some final words from Blakemore herself.
This is why. So we sometimes laugh about teenagers. They're parodied, sometimes even demonized in the media for their kind of typical teenage behavior. They take risks, they're sometimes moody, they're very self-conscious. I have a really nice anecdote from a friend of mine who said that the thing he noticed most about his teenage daughters before and after puberty was their level of embarrassment in front of him. So he said, before puberty, if my two daughters were messing around in a shop, I'd say, hey, stop messing around and I'll sing your favourite song. And instantly they'd stop messing around and he'd sing their favourite song. After puberty, that became the threat. The very notion of their dad singing in public was enough to make them behave. So people often ask, well, is adolescence a kind of recent phenomenon? Is it something we've invented recently in the West? And actually, the answer is probably not. There are lots of descriptions of adolescence in history that sound very similar to the descriptions we use today. So there's a famous quote by Shakespeare from The Winter's Tale, where he describes adolescence as follows. I would there were no age between 10 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there's nothing in the between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancient tree, stealing, fighting. He then goes on to say, having said that, would any but these boiled brains of 19 and 2 and 20 hunt in this weather? So, almost 400 years ago, Shakespeare was portraying adolescents in a very similar light to the light that we portray them in today. But today, we try to understand their behaviour in terms of the underlying changes that are going on in their brain.
Take that, Epstein. Shakespeare. Yeah. So, my professional practice. Rudder quotes Jensen, yes, Jensen, that this is the first generation of teenagers that has access to this information, and they need to understand some of their vulnerabilities. And I really took to heart what Jensen said. She said, here are a few important reminders. First, be tolerant of your teens' misadventures, but make sure to talk to them calmly about their mistakes. Next, don't be shocked when your teens do something stupid and then say they don't know why. You know why. But explain to them how their prefrontal lobes haven't quite come online yet. And remember, even the smartest, most obedient, meekest kids will do something stupid before graduating from adolescence. I think that this is teacher approved. I think teachers could definitely take these two pieces of advice and implement them in their classrooms. Next, Jensen gives a couple more important reminders. First, communicate and relate. Emphasize the positive things in your teens' lives and encourage them to try different activities and new ways of thinking about things. Reinforce that you are there for them when they need advice. Again, I think great. Teacher approved. Teachers could definitely implement this in the classroom with their own students. Moving on. The last bit of advice Jensen provides is social networking tools and websites are an important avenue of communication with your teens. Some parents report that their most successful and meaningful conversations with their teens actually occurred while texting back and forth with them. And if you don't know how to text yet, ask your teenager. Now, this one I want to hold off on saying should be teacher approved and that teachers could implement in the classroom. I think it could be very risky communicating with teens as a teacher, them being the student, through social media, through texting. I think it's an interesting thing to consider, an interesting thing to figure out if it could actually take place, because having some of those meaningful conversations between teachers and students could be amazing. But with all the things going on in the media and in society, I just think that this one needs to be worked out properly. So, my takeaways: be understanding, empathetic, tolerant. Help adolescents understand what is going on with their brains, because you know it, we know it. They don't. And lastly, overestimate the capabilities of adolescents. But be understanding if they fall short of those overestimations. Take a look at the meme on the right. Welcome to being a parent, or maybe even a teacher, of a teenager. Prepare for a large amount of eye-rolling, emotional outbursts, and thoughts of running away. And that's just being the parents. Don't take the advice of that. Let's get rid of that. Try to take the 3 things on the right instead.